Yeah, so thanks everyone for turning up and showing up to my talk today. And thank you so much to the organizers of ScotlandPHP for putting on such a fantastic event. I hope it's me as much or even better of a success than last year. So thank you. So before I bore you too much, I might as well tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm Craig McCreath, known pretty much everywhere on the social media as Fuse Reality. And I'm from Edinburgh originally, and I've been living in Dundee for the past 10 years or so. And I've been working with a company called MTC since about 2011, so 6.5 years. It was quite big in our field. There I'm a senior developer, and I also help manage teams and other assorted admin tasks. So you will have seen MTC around the place a bit. You'll see we're on the sponsors and stuff, but it doesn't really tell you who we are. So we were formed in 1999 with offices in Dundee, Edinburgh, Riga, and people across Europe remotely. Overall, we've got about 100 digital experts working for us, a lot in marketing, some in development, some in front end, and a lot of project managers as well. So we really are a growing company, and we're endlessly growing, which is why you've got those leaflets in your swag bags saying, if you're interested. So that's keep my boss happy. So here's our sort of head office in Dundee. We've got 2 offices in Dundee, and yeah, Dundee's one of the sunniest cities in Scotland, so if you're ever wanting to see at least 3 days of sun a year, then yeah, try Dundee. Wonderful. So we work, our project range can vary. It can be like your one-stop man shop around the corner, builders and plumbers, but it can go all up to large multinational brands. For example, here we've got, which ones you'll know about, BrewDog, Umbro, Sleep in the Park, who are doing this great fundraising thing to help end homelessness in Edinburgh. Superga Shoes, Hearts, Midlothian, so no Hibs yet, so there's no fight in there yet. And yeah, Buckfast, which they've got some interesting stuff going on, so not just alcoholics. So let's go and think about what makes code legacy. Well, think about it, legacy code is just code that still works. It's absolutely fine, but we now know there's faster or more efficient ways of working that you want to go and use. So who here knows Laravel? I hope a lot of you do. Oh, the first time I gave this talk, nobody put their hands up, and I was like, oh my God. So I'm happy everyone said that. So of course, Laravel is a PHP framework, which is #1 in the top of the PHP tags on GitHub. So it's one of the most popular PHP frameworks. And one good thing is Spatey as well as an agency who's been building mainly Laravel type frameworks as well. So the top 2 PHP developers in the entire of GitHub are for Laravel type components. So why do we at MTC use Laravel? Well, when we wanted to go and approach a framework we wanted to have something that would be easy to learn, had excellent documentation, long-term support, and something we can roll out easily across the team. Because if you've got 100+ experts, you need something that's going to be easy. You can't just go deep first into a framework that's going to take weeks and weeks for people to learn. So legacy, it's kind of a dirty word, isn't it? You go and talk about it, and you're saying, oh, I've got this new legacy project I've got to maintain, and you start feeling a little bit dirty, and you've got to, oh, I don't want to deal with that, it's legacy. But if you talk to anyone outside of our field, it's a good thing. It's something that you're passing on to the next generation. And part of this talk is going to be seeing about how we can tackle these and how we can make sure, if you're ever doing them again, that you're not going to have the next legacy code base coming up soon. So you've all probably seen this chart at some point with clients somewhere. You can do something good, you can do something fast, and you can do something cheap. But you can't do all of them at once. It's an impossibility. And there's really 3 different ways that I'm going to approach this talk of talking about how we can go and refactor our Laravel applications. There's a good way, there's a fast way, there's a cheap way, but all of them have their own pitfalls and pros and cons. So the first way I would do it is always suggest to only bring in what you need. And what do I mean by that? Well, we may actually have an application that works absolutely fine. The idea of legacy is the application works, and it is working, but we know there's more efficient ways of working now. So you think about that, we can actually just, bring in what we need. So it also helps if you've got an application that works fairly well already, and with a bit of work, love, and care, we can make it work a lot better. So if you ever looked into Laravel and looked into the composer JSON that comes with it, you'll notice that when you download Laravel, it doesn't actually have most of it in it. It actually references the Laravel framework, and that's another package that's available on CAPTCHAs. And that in itself references something called Illuminate, and this is their package collection here in GitHub. And what this is every single package within Laravel that's needed to run it is its own self-contained repository, and we can go and bring these things in one by one. So in our case, there's quite a few that can come through. And there's a lovely package called Torch by Matt Stalver, which will show every single one of these as they are, so you can see how you can use them outside of Laravel and get them set up. I'm not going to go for every single one. I'm going to go and show you a few of these that we have found useful in building our framework. So internally in MTC, we've always had a tradition of having some of our own in-house systems. So we've gone and opted at realizing that our database stuff maybe wasn't the greatest. Maybe our validation could do improvements, as well as adding in events for our packages. So we thought we'll take what we need from Laravel and apply it to our own code base. It's much easier than trying to refactor the whole thing. So let me get started and show you a little bit with the database first. So I have built a really, really dumb and boring little application here. So I'll give you a wee tour first. So in here, our little index, we've got a little bootstrap file. And all that's doing is bringing in Composer. And in Composer, all we have here is a really basic thing with just showing faker, just so I can put in some fake data without having to add in thousands of rows by myself. So if we go back to our bootstrap, you can see that I'm pulling in this app. And within the app, if I scroll up, all we're doing is loading up a config and spooling up a database connection with PDO. Nothing really fancy. And all it shows is it gets me a list of people, and that class in itself is super basic. It's just getting a list of all. I'm not going to write up loads of stuff we're not going to use. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So if I go and load that on the browser, if I can find my browser, here we go, right next to DevStar Plans. We've got our, yeah, a bit bigger. Please go bigger. There we go. Oh no! Cool. So you can tell I've done this a few times because I've not actually cleared the database out, but it's pulling out 1,000 odd results of different users in the system. So if you've used Laravel, you've probably used the Eloquent ORM and you've seen the models that that can generate, and that's something that we found in our system we really wanted to go and use. So I'll show you how you can get it up and running, because Laravel does a lot of it in the back end for you. All you have to do for Laravel to get up and running is set up the configuration, and that will do all of it. But of course, that's in the backside. So when you're bringing stuff into your application, you have to do the initialization yourself. So all you have to do to bring in the Illuminate database is to ask for it. So instead of pulling in the full Laravel framework, you only bring in Illuminate database, and you can start running it almost straight away. In the index, I've just made a couple of changes, but let me go and show you the app first. So as well as having the basic database initialization we showed earlier with PDO, I just added a new one for Eloquent and imported this database capsule manager. That allows me to define what Laravel does automatically. It defines that MySQL connection in this case, allows it to set it as global, which allows us to then use the capsule as kind of like the DB facade almost, where you can start calling basic tables and queries on there, and also booting up the Eloquent ORM. You can also do something else later on if we're doing an event as well, to actually initialize the event system so you can capture when like models are updated. So we had this basic person model before. So this class was pretty much just doing SQL queries. But I've now added in with the autoloader, I brought in this app one as well, and I brought in a second person just to show you that we can bring in those models as well. And these two things can live side by side. Although I would recommend if you are going to go and bother putting this in, you'd try and refactor everything, not just add a new one for the latest things, then you're maintaining two different versions. In this case, that allows me to use the exact same system, so I can now use Eloquent. I can now use Eloquent to go and create new people, and I can also use a regular capsule and just call it directly. So that works perfectly fine, and I'm going to make even more people in my people table. Yay, 1,313. 2 13s, that's pretty unlucky for a talk. Cool. So that's the first thing. The other thing I would do is validation. If you've ever tried to do validation on a basic PHP thing, it can get a bit messy. So I'm just going to use the exact same system here, and I'm using tags to save you from my typos. I've now made a few changes. So I've put in some nice styling because I don't want to bore you with terrible HTML tables. And yeah, I've had a basic list of people, and I've also put in a nice item.php. And this is raw PHP. It's the sort of stuff that you probably want to go and refactor at some point. In this case, all I've done is had a basic form with names and address and emails. So I'll show you that in the front end. So here's that nice table, which is far too big for the screen. And we can now go edit. We can now go and save things, but we can also go and remove everything to test that validation. So now it's saying, sorry, you can't do that. And yeah, the email you provided isn't valid. So within the code, what we're having to do there, though, is we're having to check every single post variable to see if it's empty, and it'll put that alert through. We also have to do another check for emails, and it starts to get pretty verbose. This is a 4-field table, so a 4-field form. So you can just imagine as this starts growing, as you're doing more and more complex forms, if you're doing it that way, it's going to get really complicated to figure out your validation. But Laravel's validation is built from the forefront to be extremely simple. You have an array of rules that you're defining against. So again, to bring that into your application, that is fairly simple. So again, you can guess where I'm going to go for this. Is in composer JSON. All I have to do is ask for that validation class. And I'll bring in most of it for you. But again, you're losing that basic initiation that's done for you with Laravel. So I've made this little class called validator. This is going to bring in all of the stuff that we need to go and get up and running. And you'll see it's a bit more complicated, but it is worth it. So we're having to bring in the container system, the file system, file loaders, translators, and factors. And that's what we need to start using this, because the validation system in Laravel is very tied down to how translations work in the system and multi-languages available. So this is the most abstracted way of kind of bringing in the validator and using it wherever you want in the application. So I've hard-coded this one to say it's going to be English, and I've now added this lang folder. This is exactly the same language system as you've got in Laravel already. So if you're used to this, you know exactly how it works. And all I've done is I've ripped the validation file out of Laravel and just pasted it into my application. Give me access to all of those URLs, all of those validation rules as they are already. So we can do things like checking if it's alphanumeric, an array. We can also add in our own custom rules down here as well, and our own custom attributes for our own code if it's that bespoke. So if I go and run this now, it's going to go and give me slightly different messages, but it's going to give me the same format. But if you look back and see the actual item page now, it's now taking what was 10, 20 lines of code down to 4 or 5 to go and say name, address, and email. And it becomes a lot more easier to read if you're bringing code bases you don't understand of saying, here's my name and address and email, here's exactly the rules I need to apply to it, without having to search around the code and finding, why is this not still working? So apply that over multiple forms across the entire web application. It's going to save you a lot of time. Lastly, I'll talk to you about events, because event systems for frameworks are kind of needed, and they are really helpful. So in our system, our sort of framework that we have, that we use most of our stuff with, we need events to save us from writing code in manually. You can imagine if you're doing an e-commerce and you're doing stuff like, maybe you're wanting to have an event happen when an order is paid. So for instance, you've got an EPOS system, and you have to tell the shop that they've sold that product. We want to have that event run, so we can add our code in without having to do manual changes every single time on the mark paid event, or when a reuser has registered, we might want to tell a third-party system to put it into their database. So again, in Laravel, that's all done pretty much for you. You can just use the event listen class and go and push that forwards. But with everything else, it's as simple as I've been saying. Composer JSON, we now ask for events, and that will get most of it set up. But we've also added a few more changes. So in our app, we now have to go and add a new thing for dispatcher. So one thing we do need to have for any events is something that's holding on to all the events listening and firing into the application. So dispatcher is just a static method in here, a static variable in here that we can go and call whenever we need to across our application. So we can say app listen or AppFire. So in my index page, all I'm doing is I'm going to go and say that get the first person, and then when I do that, I'm going to go fire a user has registered event. So in this case, it could be for any new registration. We could also use this for orders marked paid or anything else as I was referring. So this event is pretty simple. We're just allowing it to take any person and storing it, and then that then gets passed to any listeners that are registered to get that event. So in my case, I'm just going to go and say that that person has sent a welcome email. You could have any domain-specific logic you needed to run this. So if I go and run this in my lovely thing, you can be told I've been sent a welcome email. I haven't really, but the good thing about events is you can use them more than once. So you can then go and fire on additional events if you feel necessary. So let me go and copy and paste this. And then I'm going to say, don't look at me. I'm going to do something terrible. Right. Person 2, and I'm going to just go and get, let me just reverse the order. There's no last attribute, so that's what you have to do. Hey, so Case1 Abernathy, that would never be a real name. Faker needs to sort themselves out. Cool, but you can imagine how that can get really powerful if you've got multiple sort of components you're bringing into your application where you don't want to have to go and make these changes manually every single time. Plus it gets really messy and complicated as you're doing that because it can be really hard to find it. So the event-driven development allows you to go and build this very easily. Of course, there's also other ones that we could talk about. The pagination one is extremely useful. There's other ones that are kind of just abstractions of our things, like the log stuff is you could just use monologue by itself. The mail, you probably just be using SwiftMail or your own thing. You can use these things out, but you may feel they're not necessary. But anything really that is like a Laravel component can be brought into your application. And if you feel that it's necessary, you can bring that through. Of course, not everything can be brought through. It is a framework after all. It has to rely on components on itself. So just like as I showed earlier with the validation, it does rely on some components that you might feel shouldn't be necessary. Like for validation, I require language. That doesn't seem to the gel there. So do keep note of that as well. Of course, there are CAPTCHAs, and that's that if you're going to be building these things, you have to take note and understand that as I showed in that example, I had 2 person classes, so you have to make sure you're not just going to cause yourself more duplicate code, more to maintain that you're going to have problems working with. Plus, that's a stopgap, and it's here easy for smaller applications to work with, but may not work for bigger applications as you're working in. So the second option, I call hybrid. You might call it a few other things like chimera, but it does make me feel like this like evil mad scientist as I'm going and working in my developer space. But the idea is that, well, let me explain this with a cat. That's the easier way of doing it. This is Venus. So a few years ago, she was the talk of the town on the internet. She's got, I think, 40 million viewers or something on Instagram. She's described differing, but there was talks of that this was actually a cat with 2 different bits of DNA and somehow would join together in some sort of crazy cat hybrid. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here. You may have your entire legacy app, but it's not going to let you stop you to actually go and merge them together. I know, it sounds crazy. Hear me out. So why and when will this work? Well, I've had clients before who have said, I have this 10-year-old code base, and I want to get it to work with my system. I want to have a brand new website and start building new things today. But I want it in 2 weeks from now, even though it might take a year or 2 years to even think about figuring out what's actually in this application. So when you've got really, really big things and you're trying to build them, that's really good. The other thing is when you want to add fast, big, and complex changes with limited changes to the existing application, you may want to do a full rebuild, but you don't want to go and have that cost to your company or to a client of doing it all in one massive chunk, especially if they're like a company that works fast. So their old application might still be getting developed and being changed, but then now your application that you're rebuilding for them is now no longer kept up to date. So it allows you to rebuild only what you need and refactor slowly or as fast as you like. So one example of this is our sort of project system that we work with in-house at MTC. So Alan, right over there. He's one of the main developers in this, and this is his baby. It's something that we use in our company to do a lot of our work. It allows us to work through our CRM for sort of call handling and registering these sort of things. It treats our billing and our invoices and our payments and reminders to all our clients. It's got our version control for getting things. There's a wrapper sort of available in there. It hosts our time tracking. It allows us to see our scheduling for our teams and our calendar and seeing what's necessary. And it also gives us some single sign-on stuff. Our clients get access to it for tickets and pushing. And of course, single sign-on across some of our other applications. And yeah, pretty much everything. Like a lot of our stuff routes through this entire application. But trying to refactor that is a bit like Jenga. If you try to refactor the ticket page, you won't realize you're accidentally taking out some billing aspect that you might be down the road. So that's where it can get scary doing these sort of just full refactors, is when you rip something out, you may take off something extremely critical to a business, and so it allows you to be a bit more safe. So how do you even start that? It's definitely an interesting conversation. So I've got 2 demos for you, because there's 2 different ways you can do it. One is if you've got an older application just using basic PHP scripts, and you can access them all with .php. That's fairly easy. There's also one for sort of if you're routing as well. So let me get that one up. Open recent, and I don't have it open. Great. Perfect. Cool. So all I've done for this application is I have downloaded the latest version of Laravel about a month ago. And I've just put in 2 different ways of this can be handled. So if you look into the public folder of Laravel, so that's where your website's going to be sort of getting hit from, and you look in sort of HE access, you'll see very clearly here there's the handle front controller. But if you're good with HE access, you'll probably know what this means, but if you're not, what it'll actually do is if a directory doesn't exist and the file doesn't exist, it's always going to go and route back to index.php. But if let's say your application doesn't have sort of routing systems, it's using HE access, it's maybe just using regular .php files, that means that whenever your application is going to get run, it's not even going to hit Laravel. So they can actually work side by side fairly independently. So in our case here, I've written a very simple about.php page that says, this is the about page. So I can just go to about.php, and that won't even hit Laravel whatsoever. Yeah, there's about page. Very quick. But that's good and well for if you're using something legacy enough that you can just go straight to the .php files. A lot of us use routing systems, and routing systems they expect to be the only one getting any routes and working. So this is where you have to make sort of decision, and it is a time, cost, and incentive here, where you have to understand that you're going to have a little bit of a slowdown, because what you're going to have to do is capture the failure event, a 404 really, in one application, and then use that as the time to go and serve up your other framework. So it's going to get slower. So I've got one example here of it using it in PHP. There's ones if you're using older ones with like PHP 5.4, but in latest PHP 5.5, they've made this extremely simple to do. So let me show you. So if you're using anything under 5.5, what you'd have to do is go through and capture any exceptions and get the handler, and then say, okay, is it a 404? Okay, let's go and then load up my router instead. So that works fine, it works well. But then what they've now got in Laravel 5.5 now is inside your routes, you can now just go and say, here's a fallback. So that will always get called instead of your actual application. It means you've got a bit better business logic than in previous versions of Laravel, where you would be stuck with just a generic 404. You can maybe register this event, you could do something really complicated. So that allows me into my controller to just go and say, yeah, load up my router.php instead. Or maybe some things you'll have to turn off or unset just to make it all work. But it's a way of, if your application's simple enough, to actually go and run them side by side and run them together. Yeah, so if I go onto my 404 this time, that just means bashing the keyboard. There we go. This would be an old router if there's a 404. I'm not going to go and bother writing a full router package for you to show that off, but that was pretty much, yeah. That. Of course, there is an actual way of sharing your users and everything else around these applications as well. You don't have to think of them running as two separate applications. You can share data between them. So yeah, let me go and explain that a bit better. So overall, the good thing about using sort of a hybrid Chimera approach is that you have the full access to Laravel without touching any existing code, allowing you to refactor these things without causing any other bad logic happening or any bad side effects. If you're able to get working without the router, you've got limited to no reduction of speed because they are running side by side instead of as one application on top of the other. And some code, it might actually be reusable across both domains. There might be stuff that's not driven by database logic or that's not getting access to anything in a particular framework, so you could always use them together. One thing I found interesting is sessions in Laravel don't use the regular session array that you may be used to in raw PHP, so it allows you to go and have these two applications working without any of them really conflicting with each other. But I always have to give bad news, don't I? You're going to have a hell of a lot of duplicate code during this process because you're still refactoring a full application. You're just doing it more slowly. So you're going to have maybe two versions of a model that exists, one in your old application, one in your new one. So if you make changes, you might have to think about doing that twice, which is up to you if that's worth it. If you're having to have like a router in the way between two systems, you are going to have speed reductions. I'd suggest Laravel because it's one of the quickest ones to boot up and get to that 404 very quickly. I think if you've got everything fairly well cached, it's going to do that probably in about 70 milliseconds-ish. So you can always go and have that as an option, but if that speed's okay for you, then that can work. Now, if you have users, additional setup time may be required to make it work. In our system right now, that project system login is actually handled with Laravel, and we are setting the right environment for both systems. But we had to take that additional time to set that up and make sure it was going to work in future. So you're probably given up at this point and thought, why don't we just rebuild everything from scratch? It's just a 10-year-old code base, it's fine. But of course, that is a pretty big mountain to climb. And don't worry, I'm not going to go and spend today going through and showing you a refactor and doing it all with you. Hand by hand, you'd kill me, so no. So when is it worth it? Well, it's worth it when you're spending more time maintaining that application than you are building new features that may be worth it. There's also the chance that, so if you're doing that a lot, then maybe you're also finding that these new and exciting techniques you really want to apply and you just can't because your code is now incompatible. Maybe the latest versions of PHP are going to be massively difficult to upgrade to. Maybe there's new composer package or something that your entire application just won't work with. So I mentioned our sort of project system and mentioned how much sort of e-commerce clients. And one of our big thing is our core, which is our sort of base framework. That's what we're calling it. Once we started building it and getting it maintained with loads of people, we had realized there was quite a bit of bloat getting generated from this because hundreds of people working on this with thousands of commits every year. You can imagine that sometimes some things sneak in. There's also a lot of duplication because if you've got code that could be up to 10 years old, there's probably someone who just copied and pasted some code and functionality, and you're going to get duplication around it. We found it pretty difficult to upgrade because without any event systems or anything driving it, we were often editing in place, which meant that, if you've ever worked with WordPress or Drupal or anything, it's the one thing you don't do. Don't edit it because then you can't upgrade. Also, deprecated functions. PHP 7 came out recently, and that wasn't a problem for us, but you can imagine that solely if throughout time, if you're not consistently maintaining it, you're going to have deprecated functions hit you, and you're going to have to spend some time maintaining. The biggest thing about running your own framework and the way we had it was a cost to learn. We had 10-year-old bases of code, and those people, many people who actually maintained it originally, disappeared. So it made it harder to learn because the knowledge was shared across the team and it was privatized. So when a new person started, we had to take a few weeks to go and get them to learn this new system. And because we've got so many plugins, modules, and components that we've built for our systems, it means that you're tied kind of to old functionality to maintain that support because it's going to be a very hard cost to then go and maintain that and go through every single package and refactor that to the new system. So you're kind of stuck with that. So we thought this kind of needs a refactor because We wanted a really simple upgrade path for our core and our components, so every single application we ever built would always be the most up-to-date. We also wanted unified support for components without hacks, making sure we never have to edit inline to make something work. We also wanted an open platform of reusable components. If you're using something like Laravel, you've got full access to wonderful people who contribute their stuff open source, and allows us to also open source if we wish to. We also want to speed up the adoption process. The slowest point for anyone starting a new business is learning all of our tools and understanding it. If you're using a framework which you know and are aware of, it allows you to go and get started in a company a lot more easier when you can say, yeah, we use Laravel for our stuff. You don't have to spend forever figuring out, well, how do I add in this new thing? You already know. So overall, we want to focus on speed, performance, and ease of use for all of our applications and for our clients as well. So I'm not going to go and talk about exactly technical stuff in this bit. I'm just going to talk to you about things that we've learned from doing it ourselves. And the first things first is don't rush in, because proper planning does save lives. If you've got 10-year-old code base, or however old it may be, you're going to go and have a system that's going to have infinite amount of features that you probably don't know about. So you have to make sure you document and understand what you're building before you start it. So take that time to plan and understand the scope of your project before you even begin to work on it. You've probably all seen this before. So pretty much don't do this alone. Is pretty much what I'm trying to say here. If you do it alone, then you're the one single point of contact everyone is going to come to whenever they have a problem. And if you ever leave a company, that's you creating instantly another legacy project, because that means that that knowledge isn't shared across your team. So making sure that other people are involved early in a refactoring process is critical, because that makes sure that we are going to have something that will last, because the knowledge is shared, and it's not going to go and become this thing of, oh, it was that guy who made it. Ugh. Yeah, I never want to be known as that guy. So everything is adapt, and things will change. Like, think of it this way. If you've ever made an application, you've always stopped about halfway through, or even at the end of a project, and said, oh, I wish I could start again. You have to understand that you are allowed to make those changes as you're building. And if you're doing a full refactor, you don't have to think that you're going to be doing the same thing over and over and over again. You have that chance when you're building it to find a better solution. So, for instance, maybe your client will come in and notice the way you're building it. You're not going to build it exactly the same. Maybe the client has new ideas. Maybe you've got new ideas about how something may be brought into the table that allow it to be better in the future. And the biggest ones, if you know what your project is, you should know how long it takes, and making sure you set that timeline. Yeah, we've learned this one the hard way, but making sure that you know to make yourself accountable for that time, and you've set that timeline so you know how long it's going to take, and people are aware of what's going on, so you're pressured yourself. Because I'm sure people have been in projects before where there's been no real timelines, and it just seems to keep dragging on and on and on, and never wants to end. So making sure you've got that timeline will make sure you stick to it, and the rest of your team will stick to an actual completed product. So that's pretty much it. So there's 3 different ways I've talked about today, and of course, you may not actually need to refactor a whole application if you want to. We can bring in, just like anything else in Composer, we can bring in just the things we need to make our application work. Of course, we can do this sort of hybrid chimera approach and refactor slowly. It's just like a full rebuild, but you're taking your time. But you're going to have that problem with 2 bits of code bases you're dealing with for a while, and you're juggling them and maintaining 2 until that refactor is complete. And of course, you can always do what I've always ever wanted to do at the end of a project and rebuild it again. But you need to be careful with that and making sure that you're understanding that there will be adaptions, that you have to go and set a timeline, make sure that other people are involved. Otherwise, you're going to be the person they're going to talk to in 5 years and say, oh, that guy wrote it. So, yeah. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening to me ramble for the past 40 minutes. I do have feedback if you want to give it to me. And yeah, thank you. So I think we've got some time for questions, do we? Yeah.
I'll just grab the mic.
Randy, run.
Any questions?
Oh, no.
You spoke about merging 2 applications together and
Yep.
about sharing data.
Yeah.
What's your kind of advice on the best way to do that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. So yeah, in terms of models, it's pretty simple because when you're building any sort of new models with 2 different data sets, it's fairly okay to share those. I think if I go and show you this is the wrong one. Yeah, you can easily have 2 models doing the same thing over and over again. That's what I'm trying to say here. But in terms of your data, it's usually a bit more difficult in terms of having those 2 applications working side by side because, yeah, as you said, you're going to be sharing the data across systems. We've not had too much of a problem just using 2 different models running it. The only thing you'll really have to think about is if you're using some things that you may be using a bit more in one than the other. So let's say if you're using Laravel on one side and you've put in events for updating and creating, let's say, users, then of course your old application won't know any of that. And when you apply that data, it wouldn't be doing it. So you can kind of apply logic of what I was talking about in the start, where you can start bringing in some of the other things to make sure you're using the actual same code. Because if you're looking at the way Laravel does a model and the way that I did it on the only needed sort of one, that code's identical. Those models will be copy and pastable between Laravel and a regular application. So in that case, you can get to a point where you're actually sharing what you're building in the new one with the old one until you're fully maintained. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Oh no.
Hi, so some of your examples early on, it looked like you were basically coupling to the Laravel framework. So whilst that's good now, in 10 years' time, it will be Laravel 5.5 will be seen as legacy.
Yeah, it'll be a dinosaur by then, yeah. So.
But are you not introducing a similar problem? You're just...
Yeah, I do get your point there. It is a case of, yeah, you are going to have a chance where you're bringing in a new framework, you're going to have that same problem. But in terms of any sort of framework, you're going to have that same problem if you go to Symfony or any other application. If you're doing a full refactor, you're going to be lodged into that sort of system. We've opted in ways that we can do refactoring a bit more easily in terms of upgrading sort of Laravel versions internally. So there's tools that allow you to, across applications, create patches that go and make things work a bit better. So in terms of your components, so if you're building a website, you're not exactly tied down entirely. But yeah, it's kind of I do get your point though, that you are tying yourself down. But in any case, you're going to tie yourself down to a framework anyway, if you're going to go and build anything new.
Well, you could decouple more.
Yeah, you could decouple more, yeah, and that's definitely an option. But yeah, you're always going to have to tie yourself in maybe a little bit for some domain-specific logic. So, go.
Cheers, Danny. Do you have any thoughts in terms of refactoring and version control and where it's sensible to do such things?
So refactoring version control?
No,
refactoring
just in the context of version controlling your application, so branch management.
Yeah, I don't really deal with that sort of side myself, but yeah, it is a sort of difficult one where you're working with that because it's kind of its own feature branch really where you're working on a brand new one, but it's almost like it becomes 2 repositories really if you're maintaining 2 different applications. But it is making sure that people are following almost the same versioning system or using the same version numbers or whatever may work to make sure you're still flowing the same application. So your release branches are always going to be in sync. So I don't have a solution to that, but yeah, it'd be cool to hear if anyone does. Yeah, I'll steal it. So catch me afterwards so I can steal your ideas.
I have one question regarding your pros and cons for the hybrid thing.
Yep, go for it.
The first con you mentioned is that you might have to duplicate your code, and I use a hybrid approach when I do migrations pretty much all the time, and I've never encountered this, so I would like to know, could you be more specific what kind of things you expose, and maybe if it's well specific or something? Yeah,
so what I was meaning by that is, like, the easiest way I can think about it is sort of models. If you've got 2 different things handling like models in your application, so in your latest one you have an elegant model building it, but in your old one you've got, let's say, another class that handles everything with users. So let's say you've got a method that says like, I think like maybe like send new reminder email or something whenever that happens. That means both applications, if you're running them in tandem, could actually both have that same method running in the same place. So it could mean that if you're going to go and upgrade that and make changes to the first one, you might have to then update it in 2 different places. In our case, what happened was because we had different shared headers and footers, in our sort of HTML, that meant that every single time we wanted to go and upgrade that, we would have 2 different menus to update. And of course, there's ways around that and ways to build it, but it does take more thought and care to make sure that happens. Go. Yeah, RT, what's your question?
Question is about the duplicate code there. So how you know
Everyone loves duplicated code today.
like I think this sort of was touched on the last question, but say you have this hybrid system and you have the legacy models or controllers and the new Laravel models and controllers.
Yeah.
Have you any sort of experience or advice on maybe using code templates, like defining a model, say in JSON or YAML, and then generating models from that? Not the code isn't in actual PHP files, but you generate those files from a template.
So I'm trying to make sure I understand your question. So you're sort of saying that do I have experience with sort of generating code via sort of example like YAML files or JSON?
Yeah.
We actually have a system in place for that. So we've got a system one of our colleagues wrote that's kind of like we call it sort of a module builder. But it's the idea of that we can generate modules, controls, and entire views just from sort of a base JSON file and create large applications and pretty much CRUD tasks very quickly. So if you're building a system where you're building a new application through, then yeah, you can definitely use something and build something quickly to go and build that duplicate code. So the only thing I would say is if you are going to go and have those 2 applications sitting side by side is it's worth cleaning up the old one and deleting the other ones once you do refactor and making sure those old paths go to the new paths, just so you're not having 2 different systems running side by side. So I think one instance was I'd forgotten to delete the staff page on the project system once we'd refactored it, and then my boss had a bookmark to the old one and was editing passwords and didn't realize it wasn't working anymore and was like, what have I done wrong? So yeah, to do that. Cool. Anything else?
What will be your approach if you had to do the same thing with 2 big frameworks, right? Because let's say that most of the frameworks are MVC frameworks, so we can see that they follow the same principles.
Yep.
So would you do also a hybrid, run 2 big frameworks together, for example?
Hybrid can work. Yeah, hybrid can work, but it can be difficult. So let's say the problem with that can be that if you are doing a hybrid like that is that you might have code in terms of Composer or something that's running maybe 2 different Symfony versions that could conflict. So that can be a major problem where that can start hitting, and maybe you're using an older version of Symfony, but then of course Laravel might use a newer version that may break everything. So it is possible. Give it a go. The other option is maybe having the new application on a subdomain, and then you're kind of sharing sessions or sharing a way of logic for user login. So I've seen this quite often where you've got like a beta dot address on someone's account, and that's where some of the stuff is getting routed. Some people are a bit more like they obfuscate that a little bit more and just call it app or B or whatever they want to call it, where they can run, instead of it being 2 different applications, you've actually got 2 different instances of applications running separately, which works just as well. It's just, yeah, it depends on it. Cool. Perfect. I think that's us for now, but yeah. Catch me if you've got any more questions after the talk, and I really appreciate every single one of you coming and talking today. Perfect.